all those of you tuning in, no matter where you're tuning in at, whatever you're tuning in on. We're just appreciative that you're here, as well as our in-studio audience, we'll say. It's kind of weird. Last week was the only week we ever had anything go wrong in like a really long time. And then people were here, and I was just like, it would only happen when people were in the building. But don't forget, we're still in our fast. Good Lord. Still in our fast. I had to switch up my fast. My job requires a great deal of focus in many different areas because I'm constantly getting called and having to do things with multiple different entities, and I could not focus. I couldn't get anything together. And I was like, I don't think God wants me to lose my job over a fast. So I had to switch it up to something that can be a bit more sustainable for me. A lot of people are asking me, they're saying I'm having aches and pains. Is that normal through a fast? Yes, it is. And it's only going to get a little bit worse. If you're having those aches, those pains, when you're waking up in the morning, feeling a bit sore, that's just how your body deals with what we would consider crash dieting, which fasting would be considered crash dieting. So if you're feeling weak, if you're feeling wobbly, and you need to switch up your diet or your fast, please do so. Pastor had to do it. I try to do strict Daniel fast. And that is basically like nuts, berries, like I was eating nothing but salad. And that's just basically all water, and it was making me so sick. And just like, I was like trying to type, and my fingers were shaking on the keyboard. So I was like, okay, it's time to change it up. But if we're sticking to it, just stick to it. Keep it. If you got to move from one to the next, do so. Just don't give up on it, because God is asking for obedience from his people. And fasting, even when it hurts, fasting, even when it's something that we crave so much, God says he rewards those who remain obedient to his call. So don't forget, you can continue to support this ministry, this move, via your tithes or offerings and your love gifts. You can do that through EasyTithe. That's you can go to easytithe.com and download the app there, or you can go to your iStore or your Google Play or your iStore, and you'll find it there. You can also go to praisechapelfresno.com, click Give on the menu bar, and it's going to take you to a third-party website we're contracted with, safe and secure there. But if you don't want to give digitally, and you want to still, do it paper-wise, I guess, analog, you can do that. We have tithes and offerings envelopes behind each and every one of our chairs with our tithes and offerings collection box, we'll say, just outside of our sanctuary. If you're joining us on our online community only, and you'd like to continue to keep giving, you can do so you can mail it in, drop it off, however you want to do it, and you can Google us, Praise Chapel Fresno, California. You'll see our address, and you can give to it. I do like that we're seeing our views going up. That's always good. Even on Wednesdays, like when we would first do this, when everyone was home during Rona, I think we would max out at like 14 views. And I'm like, I know there's more than 14 people in this church, and I know y'all are home. And then now we're seeing that going up, and I really appreciate that, even to a point that in some of the stuff our social media team is putting together, we're having other entities reaching out to us and asking us if we want to partner in things and do things. So we see that, the social media and our live casting has been something that's been widely beneficial. So we want to continue to develop that, especially for those that are viewing at home. We want to give you guys a better viewing experience. But again, this Wednesday thing isn't a permanent solution. We're talking with our leadership group about how we want to manage our Wednesdays, what we want to do for that. But for the meantime, we just want to make sure that we have a beautiful online presence, which I think our media team has really done a good job of. So I do like going live casting, and it's really weird live casting specifically about having people in the building, but we'll manage it. Last week, I was all over the place because I'd see people move. And usually on Wednesdays, nobody's moving because there's only like 4 people here. But we're going to keep going through this. So we're still in the biblical bios, and I had realized that as I was going through, someone had texted me and said, hey, you should do one on this person. I was like, well, doesn't she come like much later in the Bible? Like, no, if you were in Ruth, you already passed her. So I went back and I read about Deborah. And Deborah's a very interesting character, and I think very instrumental in showing what God can use and how he uses them. So Deborah, I'm using a biblical reference. I'm going from Judges 4:4 is the first time she's mentioned. And she has an entire chapter of a song that happens in chapter 5, verses 1 through 31. She writes a song about everything that happens in chapter 4. So she's a woman that was known for her wisdom and her courage. She was both a priestess and a prophet of God. She would be only one of 2 people that would carry both of those offices throughout the entire Bible, and the other one would be Samuel. She was the only female judge ever mentioned in the Bible, And while she didn't offer any sacrifices, she was called a priestess, but she didn't actually occupy the office of the priest. So she was never entering into the building. She was never giving sacrifices. That was designated for males only. But what she would do is she would lead worship outside the tabernacle. And as well as she would be preaching outside in the tabernacle. When people start looking at this, and you have to take a lot of information about Deborah too from the Torah, and that's kind of the original, would say, of the Hebrew Bible. But it goes into details that aren't really specific to canonization for Christianity, but it is significant to the Jewish faith. You find a lot more about Deborah in there. But her narrative begins with Israel doing what Israel does best, and that is basically just doing evil in the sight of the Lord. Again, so what God does, and if you remember this, we've talked about this, other like patriarchs of the faith have told them, do not allow idols in. If you do, God will remove his protection. And they just keep doing that time and time again. So at this point, the Canaanites are ruling over them. And then they cry out to God because the commander of this army, of the Canaanite army, his name was Sisera. He was a pretty harsh dude. And he also commanded the greatest military technology they had, which was iron chariots. So you might think, like, iron chariots, how is that such a big deal? Well, wooden chariots would often break down. And also, if you rode a wooden chariot through, let's say, a platoon of men, it's going to break more than it's going to injure other people. But the iron chariot, you could run right over people with. But he's pretty harsh, dude, and it takes them 20 years of this oppression for Israel to realize that they had done wrong in the sight of the Lord. And it's so funny, like, they did wrong. God removes that protection. Canaan comes in and gets in there like, what's going on here? What's going on? It took 20 years for them to realize that it was actually something they were doing rather than just the Canaanites being better than they were. What I think is funny is throughout this entire time, there may be times when we wish God would leave us alone. Because it almost seems like that with Israel. When you start reading, even before this in the book of Judges, it kind of seems like Israel is getting really upset with what God's doing and how God's doing it. And I think there are times that some people just want God to leave us alone, yet we ultimately thankful for his continued dealing with us even when it isn't comfortable. So all through this time that they're being oppressed, it draws Israel right back to God. It draws them right there. Now they were practicing their faith, but what they were doing was they were allowing the influence of other cultures to kind of change how they pray, change who they worship. And so it took 20 years for them to realize that's what was wrong, and so they get rid of all of it. And this is what we see with Deborah. The first time she's mentioned is in chapter 4, verse 4 and 5. Deborah, a prophetess and a wife of Lapidoth. I'm going to pause right there for a second. Different translations say wife and different translations say woman. It's not really important. They're like, well, she was married to this Lapidoth, but the translation that they use in the original Hebrew, it just means woman. So it's likely this man was either ruling over the tribe that she came from, because they use a different word when they talk about bride. They don't use wife. Was judging Israel at that time. She would sit under a palm tree of Deborah between Ramon and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to settle their disputes. Now, some people consider unexpected that God would use a woman as a prophetess, but the New Testament makes it clear that God grants gifts, the gift of prophecy to anyone who will diligently follow him. It's even more unexpected that God would raise a woman to be a judge over Israel. They didn't occupy those types of stature in society. Judges sought guidance from the Lord by praying and meditating before proclaiming the ruling on the matter. Many of the judges were also thought to be prophets as well because they were articulating a word from God, but most of the definition of prophet is really speaking into someone's life about something they already know, something that God has touched them about, or something that God's about to do, not just giving a ruling based off of the laws of God. So Deborah would post up under these trees every day, and people would line up ready to take their issues to her, and whatever she ruled on, they followed. And you find out that Deborah was highly revered in their society at that time. You'd find that a lot of people got a good following because when she went out and did something, people actually got up and started moving. And then Judges 6 and 7, this is where she starts enacting the office of the prophetess. Verse 6, she summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali. Why we gotta have so many complicated words like back to back? In Naphtali, and said to him, hasn't the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go and deploy the troops on Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men, that the Naphtalites and Zebulunites, then I will lure Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, his chariots and his infantry at the Wadi Kishon to fight against you, and I will hand him over to you. So Deborah basically summons Israel's kind of what we would consider like chief warrior. Okay, he's not really commander of an army, but much like David, people would know him to be one that not only won battles through brute strength, but also through military strategy. So she summons him, and she just simply is confirming something that the Lord has already spoken to Barak, telling him that he had to move towards the enemy, and then God will draw the enemy out. She didn't hear it first. Barak heard it first, but she hears it. She hears from God what Barak was supposed to do. So he's sitting on something that God had already instructed him to do, and then God confirms it through Deborah to him. God often brings confirmation when he speaks to us, especially if what we believe he wants us to do will affect other people. And my wife and I had just recently been recipients of this, of going through a decision-making process of something, and both of us not only fasting and praying, but really asking for a confirmation. And I feel like that was a detriment to me and my wife, because the confirmation we got was rather dark. It wasn't a confirmation of, oh yeah, everything's going to work out, everything's going to be great, everything's going to be this. It was like, you either have to do this, or this is what's going to happen. This is how it's going to happen. And I believe someone was given that in not that they occupy an office of a prophet, but that God would use someone else to confirm to us, because we know decisions are going to affect other people's lives. And that's what God does here with Deborah, just to confirm something with him that he's already heard from God. But this is how Barak responds to her. In verse 8, he says, but Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Now that's kind of crazy, because here God has told him to do something. Here God has said, go and do this. It's confirmed by Deborah, who he knows as not just a judge, not just one who is dutiful in her prayer life, but also one that follows the word of God. And he says, well, if you're not going to go with me, then I'm just not going to do it. Now, he must have been greatly impressed with Deborah, the prophetess and the judge, because he tells her, if you go with me, I'll go. It didn't seem unwise of Barak to ask Deborah to come with him, yet the fact that he demanded it showed he trusted more in Deborah's relationship with God than he trusted in his own relationship, really reflecting on a lack of trust in God's promised victory. See, sometimes we tend to assume that we need other people, that we deem possibly more faithful or possibly more religious to achieve a promise that God has given to us. But God didn't call them, God called you. He may use somebody else to confirm a word, but he called you. He didn't call them. If God had called them, she would have said, God has called me to do this with you, so let's go do it. But he didn't. But this is how Deborah responds. Verse 9, I will gladly go with you, she said, but you will receive no honor on the road you are about to take, because the Lord will sell Sisera to a woman. So Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. So she agrees to come, but she also chides Barak for asking her to do so. In a sense, she's challenging his manhood, because she says, on the road you're about to take, the road includes her. He wasn't supposed to take that road. He was supposed to take the road that God had called him. For military victory to be credited to a woman would have both been unexpected and embarrassing to a military commander. And everybody knows that if Deborah's there, Deborah's likely going to be the one that made everything happen. She prophesies that his chosen approach, the road you're going on, will mean glory for the victory will go to a woman, not to him. In the time that this was written, society did not consider women fighters. They didn't consider them, they weren't accepted as leaders. But Deborah would be considered an exception to her culture. Most of what they were kind of tasked with on the day-to-day was home operations. You'll find out that they actually would be the ones that would pitch the tents. But it was basically home operations, and they followed their husbands wherever they went. Now, those that were in leadership or judges of Israel that had wives, the wives were kind of like seen as higher station, but they weren't followed in the same line as the authority their husband carried. So she and Barak, they begin traveling around. They gathered 10,000 fighters that God had commanded Barak to amass. The enemy commander, Sisera, he hears of this, and he starts mobilizing his army. And he says, get all the chariots and get all the men ready because something's going down. And then Deborah tells Barak that now's the time to attack. And it's because God has gone before him. So again, it kind of makes it sound like when you read the narrative, she says, now is the time for you to go. Has God not gone before you? So it sounds like she still has to convince this man that God will make do on his promise, that God is already there. And then verses 15 and 16, we read this. Then the Lord threw Sisera and all of his charioteers and all of his army into a panic before Barak's assault. Sisera left his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth of the nations, and the whole army of Sisera fell by the sword. Not a single man was left. So the entire army gets decimated. The buildup between this major battle for Israel's independence from Canaan is resolved in 2 verses. So they're under occupation by the Canaanites at this point. Immediately after that second verse, it says, all of them fell by the sword that day. Not a single man was left. They were no longer occupied by Canaan. Now, following this verses, we would show that the valley that Canaan was preparing their attack in, there was a storm or a flood swelled a river nearby, sweeping away some of the enemy. But also what it did is it made those chariots useless. So anything that you can guarantee, iron is extremely heavy. And what happened was as the ground began to soften, the chariots began to sink. They are now useless in battle. That's what these men had an assumption. This was their upper hand on Israel. Now, some people will say it was because they saw Deborah, and they knew that if Deborah was there, that God was on Israel's side at this point. But that's not accredited. That's just something because they say they go into a panic. But you read later on in chapter 5, Deborah specifically sings about the chariots getting stuck, the water coming down. So Sisera, realizing the battle would be lost and that his own chariot was useless, got down, ran away on foot, and he comes to another tribe's land and finds a tent to hide in. This other tribe's land that he lives in, he has a peace treaty with the ruler of that tribe that they wouldn't fight each other, so he feels safe there. So a woman comes out named Jael, allowed him to come into her tent. Her husband, she was the wife of the tribal leader, so it's likely she's met Sisera before this. They have this peace agreement between the two of them. So he lays down because he's exhausted from running away from Israel. And he tells her, like, woman, give me something to drink. She gives him some milk. She covers him up. And he says, guard the entrance because I don't want anything to happen to me. And she basically, like, is comforting him, telling him nothing's going to happen to you. Everything's okay. But God had the promise that God had given to Barak that the enemy would fall into the hands of a woman. Everybody assumes that God means Deborah. But we read this in verse 21. While he was sleeping from exhaustion, Heber's wife Jael took a tent peg, grabbed a hammer, and went silently to Sisera. She hammered the peg into his temple and drove it into the ground, and he died. That's brutal. This violence seems to come out of nowhere. Jael instantly pivots from a gracious hostess to a brutal killer. And the temple, like, I don't know why so many people are so caught up with this. They're like, it wasn't exactly on the temple. It just means his head. No, when it talks about the temple, it means this part of it. So it's on a really soft portion between the eye and the ear that she would hammer through. But she knew how to handle a tent peg because it was customarily the woman's job to pitch the tent. And this thing is about 12 inches long. It's likely almost about a ½ inch in diameter, super sharp. She stuck the tent peg so hard that it went down into the ground, and it's very likely this took multiple blows. But it's just a brutal but deserving death to a man. And I love the irony of the verse at the very end, and he died. Yeah, I would hope so. Like, I wouldn't want a 12-inch spike driven through my head and get up and be like, what just happened? As soon as Barak and his army get close, Jael, she runs out, and she grabs Barak, and she asks him to follow her. Which if Barak had known what she was about to show him, I doubt he would have been so comfortable following her into her tent. But he follows her in, and she shows him the body of Sisera nailed to the floor. And then what ends up happening is Israel sees peace for about 40 years. Then Judges chapter 5 is a song all about Deborah writing, commemorating God's victory over Canaan through this. And so what's really interesting is I went through a litany of different translations trying to see if Deborah ever says, and the glory won't go to you, but it'll go to me or anything, and none of them do. It says a woman. All of them list a woman, and it's highly interesting, and I find it incredibly awesome that it would be a woman that would ultimately kill the leader of Canaan, but that it didn't have to be Deborah, but it was going to be a woman. So here's 4 things we can learn from Deborah. Number 1, don't let culture dictate what you can do through God. In her culture, in her day, there were a very set, very strict regulations on what women were able to do, and leadership positions was definitely not among them, let alone to be involved in military strategy. So the role was basically in her home, but Deborah didn't allow the culture or the influences of the culture to direct what she was going to do through God. See, the church exists in the culture, but it's not to be influenced by the culture, it's to influence the culture. So we don't allow the culture that we're currently in to influence how we preach, what we say, how we say it. But what we should be doing as a church is going out and influencing the culture closer to God. Culture today demands that you see it their way and then calls you a bigot when you stand your ground. I'll go into that at a different time. Don't allow the culture you're in to cancel what God has planned for you. Number 2, don't conquer sin, destroy it. Every single time that they are freed from oppression, Israel is given a very easy rule to follow. Destroy everything from their culture. Destroy everything that they brought onto your land. Because God knew that eventually what ends up happening is that culture begins to influence them to God. And it does every single time. When you read Israel had sinned in the face of God again, when you go back and read it, it always comes back to the culture that previously had oppressed them that was left. They kept pieces of that with them. And it eventually, very slowly, leads them further away from God. So it would be the Canaanites, the Midianites, the Philistines. They reshaped their culture, eventually turning their hearts away from God. It's not enough just to repent of our sins. Yes, we need to do that. But what we do is we repent and then we keep it close by, or we hold on to a portion of it. Maybe it's just something we're comfortable with. Maybe it's just that person that we don't want to let go of yet. But it begins to reshape how you respond to God. Because it's a lot like oil and water. Once you introduce oil into water, the water is no longer drinkable. You have to purify it. And what's hitting here is if we just keep them close by, it eventually influences back to bondage. Sin needs to be destroyed, obliterated, with no trace of it left behind in our lives, because that's what God commanded of the Israelites every time they were under occupation, as if they never existed, and they still didn't do that. They kept things of that culture with them. They allowed the influence of the enemy to continue to draw them further away from God. And there's actually a sermon that Charles Spurgeon speaks of about Jael driving the spake through Sisera's head, and he says, don't just conquer, or don't just get away from sin, kill it. Because he knows if you leave it around, if you keep it around you long enough, it influences you away from God. Number 3, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Deborah in the Bible doesn't question God's voice or wonder what others will say about her or think about her. She simply has the faith to do what God tells her to do. Now, whether people follow or not is none of her concern. She has no concern for that. Because what is she doing? Every morning she gets up and she goes to a tree. She's not walking around trying to get people to recognize who she is. She's not walking around telling people, did you know I'm a judge of Israel? She just goes up on the tree and she says, God will bring him. Her only concern was doing what the Lord had called her to do and not letting anything get in the way of that. See, doubt and fear whisper in our ears constantly, crumbling what God is trying to do and sending us retreating back in the shadows into a comfort zone. We allow our feelings of qualification keep us from stepping into the role that God has qualified us for. I know so many people that do that in church in these days. You know, even I, at a certain point when we were kind of in a transition period, you know, I'm sitting here, I'm like, God, I don't have the qualifications to do anything like this. I don't know why you've called me to this. I don't know why you've done it. And I didn't get a response that time, but I believed I was faithful and kept moving towards it. And it was only after I stepped into the promise that it was that God sat here and said, it's not you that has to qualify for the position. I will qualify you. And lastly, number 4, be faithful in weakness, not weak in faith. Barak was spoken to by God before Deborah, and he chose not to believe it. Now, some would say it was his unwillingness to rise up against Canaan. Maybe it was out of fear for it. I just don't think he believed it was really God. They'd been turned away from God for 20 years. They've been praying to all these things, and I believe that when Barak heard this, he's like, that ain't really God. Because Deborah comes up and says, hasn't the Lord your God said to you? That's very poignant, but his faith was weak, and that's why God confirms it through Deborah. And because of this weakness that he carries all throughout this passage, he never receives the full portion of the promise of God. He never receives the accolade for what has happened. There are times in our life God is speaking directly to you, and you're afraid to move on it. Or you're waiting for God to be just a little bit clearer. But Deborah has to remind Barak that God has already gone before him. The victory was just waiting to be claimed. So when you feel like you're not enough or that you don't have enough to do what God is calling you to do, remember that God has already gone before you. So if God has called you to do something or you're going through something, God has already gone before you and has staked up a victory that you have to walk in and claim. And if you wait on others, if you wait on other people to confirm it, if you wait on other people to basically walk you over like you're a child to claim the victory, you're never going to receive the full portion of what God wanted to release in your life because you had to wait on somebody else to do it. Just be faithful and claim it. Just walk in and claim it. Now, Deborah's narrative, much like Ruth's, is very short. Like, they don't really say a whole lot in it, but it doesn't speak against their character. It only shows that when Deborah went out with Barak, they got 10,000 men pretty quickly. So she's likely a very influential person of her time. But just the fact that there's so little written about her, but she's the only female judge and prophetess that is ever mentioned in the Bible, is pretty interesting to me. And I was kind of sad that I skipped over Deborah because I was trying to keep this whole thing in chronological order. But I'm glad someone reached out and said, hey, you forgot this one, and it's really nice. And I did. As I studied through that and tore it apart, I realized how much of an impact Deborah had on her day in Israel. But we're still going to be going through these biblical bios as we go through. Stay tuned for information that we're going to be putting out here pretty soon of other things we're going to be doing. Stay tuned to our website. We'll be posting stuff up there. Keep to your fast. Keep to your prayers. Even throughout the day, the fast that I'm doing, like towards 4 to 5 o'clock, like I'm shaking again, but I'm pretty much done with work, so I don't have to focus or concentrate on anything. I feel like it's better. But just if you got to switch it up, just remember those other fasts that we can do, that you can jump into. Yes, it has to be a sacrifice. Yes, we need to go through these things and hold to what God's asking us to do and remain faithful and obedient to his word. But I think that's why we have so many options for fasting, is we can figure out which one's going to work best for us at what time. And again, mine was switched up simply because of my job. Like I could not focus and was shaking. And like it was bad, so switched it up. But we love you guys. Remember, you can continue to support this ministry via your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts, which is so funny because people ask, they're like, why do you say it twice? Well, because when the people that first log in, is not the same amount of the people that we see at the end of our live cast. So you can do that via tithes, offerings, love gifts, via Easy Tithe. You can download the app at Google Play or the iStore. You can also go to easytithe.com and download the app that way. Search Praise Chapel Fresno. You'll see us, connect with us. You can also go to praisechapelfresno.com, click the give button on the menu bar. It's going to take you to a third-party website we're contracted with. You can give through there. And if you're joining us on our in-person services, we have tithes and offerings envelopes behind each and every one of our chairs with our tithes and offerings box located just outside of the sanctuary. You can drop it off in. We'll get it deposited in a timely manner. If you're joining us on our online campus only, you can mail in or drop off these gifts, your tithes, your offerings, your love gifts. You can do that. You can Google Praise Chapel Fresno, California, see our address. Once you drop it off, we'll get it deposited in a timely manner. We're here all throughout the week, just popping in here and there. So we'll see it. We'll get it deposited. But we love you guys. Sunday's coming up. Great, powerful word I feel like God's given me for this Sunday. So don't miss out on it. And for those of you that are joining us on our social media and reaching out to us, we appreciate that. We love that. Keep doing it. And all those words of encouragement that are coming through, love it and it's pumping me up. But stick to the fast, and we'll see you guys Sunday morning, 10 a.m. We love you. Have a good night.